a candlelit tower, a solitary figure bent over cryptic verses. For 500 years, people have whispered his name in times of crisis. Tonight, let his story carry you gently into sleep. This is the tale of Nostradamus. Chapter 1. The Physician's Apprenticeship. The plague arrived without warning, turning vibrant towns into silent graveyards within weeks. While most fled in terror, a young man named Michel de Nostradamus walked steadily toward the dying. He had no official credentials, no university degree yet, just an apothecary's knowledge and an unusual willingness to observe what others preferred to ignore. He was born in 1503 in the sun-baked hills of southern France, in the small town of Saint-Remy. His family carried a quiet burden. They were Jewish converts, forced to abandon their faith when King Charles VIII offered every Jew in Provence a simple choice: baptism or exile. The Nostradamus family chose survival, taking Christian names and attending Mass, while privately preserving fragments of their ancestral learning. Michel's grandfather became his first teacher, introducing the boy to mathematics, astronomy, and ancient texts that the church preferred remained closed. In the privacy of that study, as twilight painted the Provencal sky purple, young Michel learned that the stars followed predictable patterns. That knowledge existed beyond approved doctrine, that observation could reveal truths hidden from common view. At 15, he left for university to study the liberal arts, but plague interrupted his education. The outbreak closed the University of Avignon, scattering students across the countryside. Michel made an unexpected choice. Instead of fleeing home, he became an apothecary's assistant, traveling through plague-ravaged villages, preparing remedies, watching the patterns of death unfold. What he learned in those years would shape everything that followed. He noticed that bleeding patients often weakened them further. He observed that disease spread through contact, and isolation slowed its progress. He began experimenting with his own treatments: rose-hip pills, clean water, fresh air. Simple interventions that contradicted medieval medicine's reliance on balancing humors and consulting astrological charts for bloodletting times. He also learned something darker. Most patients would die regardless of intervention. Medicine was as much about comfort as cure. Sometimes the kindest act was simply being present while death completed its work. By 1529, Michel felt ready for formal medical training at the University of Montpellier, one of Europe's most prestigious schools. Here was his chance to become a legitimate physician. But the faculty discovered he had worked as an apothecary, a manual trade they considered beneath university-trained doctors. Worse, he had publicly questioned established treatments, suggesting that observation might teach more than ancient texts. They expelled him after less than 2 years. They called him an innovator, and they didn't mean it as praise. Most men would have abandoned medicine entirely after such rejection. Michel simply ignored the faculty's judgment and established his own practice, building reputation through results rather than credentials. Patients came. They recovered at surprising rates. Word spread of this unlicensed healer who defied convention and delivered outcomes. He settled in again, a prosperous southwestern town where his life briefly assumed conventional shape. He married, fathered 2 children, built a respectable practice. For a few years, it seemed the restless outsider had found his place. Then plague returned to Agen in 1534. Michel's wife contracted it, and his children. The great healer who had walked through epidemic after epidemic unscathed could not save his own family. He applied every treatment he knew. He prayed. They died anyway. What followed was worse than grief. His wife's family sued for the return of her dowry. Professional rivals whispered that a physician who couldn't save his own wife was no physician at all. The Inquisition began asking uncomfortable questions about statements he'd made that seemed to question church doctrine. Michel fled. For the next 6 years, he vanished into what historians call his lost years. No records survive of where he went, or what he did. Some accounts suggest Italy. Others claim he traveled as far as Sicily or even the Middle East. A few whisper of secret schools of mystical learning. What we know with certainty is that the man who emerged in 1540 was different. The physician remained, but something else had been added, or awakened. He resurfaced in Marseille in 1544, when plague struck with unusual ferocity. The official physicians fled. Michel stayed. For 9 months he worked without rest, treating the sick, organizing quarantines, distributing his remedies. The grateful city council awarded him a pension. At 41, scarred by loss and hardened by rejection, he had finally achieved recognition. He could have stopped there, spending his remaining years as a comfortable provincial doctor. Instead, he married again, a wealthy widow named Anne Consardi, and moved to the small town of Salon-de-Provence, about 20 miles from Marseille. The house he purchased on the Rue de la Poissonnerie still stands. Its upper floor contained a study where Michel increasingly retreated as his medical practice thrived. Anne managed the household and bore him 6 children, asking few questions about what her husband did in that upstairs room after sunset. What was he doing? Officially, he was writing Almanac's popular publications, predicting weather and providing astrological forecasts for the coming year. Nothing unusual there. Every astrologer in Europe published almanacs. But Michel's almanacs were different. They sold extraordinarily well. They contained predictions that seemed oddly specific, warnings that occasionally proved accurate. And they included verses short, cryptic 4-line poems called quatrains predictions, written in language so obscure they could mean almost anything. In 1555, Michel published his first major almanac under a Latinized version of his name. No longer Michel de Nostradamus, the expelled medical student and grief-stricken widower. Now he was Nostradamus, prophet of the age to come. The transformation was complete. But in that upstairs study, by candlelight, something more ambitious was taking shape. He was writing prophecies that would outlive him by centuries. He was attempting to pierce the veil of time itself. Let your breathing slow as we move deeper into his story. Chapter 2. The Court of Shadows. The summons arrived in 1555, carried by royal messenger. Catherine de' Medici, wife of King Henry II and the most powerful woman in France, requested Nostradamus's presence at the royal court in Paris. This was not an invitation one could decline. The journey from Salon to Paris took weeks, each jolt of the horse-drawn carriage agony for a man suffering from gout. But Nostradamus went. The alternative, insulting the future Queen of France, tended to be fatal. Paris in the mid-16th century sprawled across both banks of the Seine, home to perhaps 300,000 souls. The royal palace was a maze of courtyards and halls where power flowed through whispers and poison as much as through official proclamations. Catherine de' Medici, Italian by birth, had brought to France a sophistication that made her both admired and feared. She maintained a network of seers and astrologers who advised her on everything from matters of state to the health of her children. She collected power in every form, and having the most famous seer in France at her disposal was itself a statement. Nostradamus was given rooms near the royal apartments and treated with careful respect. He understood the danger. Respect from royalty elevates you, certainly, but also makes you responsible for every word. One wrong prediction could transform fine wine into an arrest warrant. The meeting with Catherine took place in private. No transcripts survive. We know only what Nostradamus later wrote in letters and what Catherine's correspondence reveals. She wanted horoscopes for all 7 of her children. She needed to know which would rule, which would prosper, which would die young. These were not idle curiosities. France was entering a period of extraordinary instability. Religious wars would soon tear the country apart. Catherine needed to know which of her sons would survive to secure the dynasty. Nostradamus cast the charts, studied planetary positions at each child's birth, performed his astrological calculations. Then he told Catherine something startling. 3 of her sons would become kings of France. This seemed unlikely. Henry II was healthy, still in his prime. Yet Nostradamus was confident. Whether he specified the troubled nature of their reigns, the religious wars, the assassinations to come, we cannot know. What we do know is that Catherine was satisfied. She rewarded him generously and sent him back to Ceylon with her protection. That protection would prove essential, because 3 years later, in 1558, King Henry II died, and the manner of his death seemed to fulfill one of Nostradamus's most famous published quatrains. The verse had appeared in Century I, quatrain 35 of his Book of Prophecies. It described a young lion defeating an old lion in combat, with the old lion's eyes pierced through a golden cage, resulting in cruel death. During a tournament celebrating royal weddings, Henry jousted against Gabriel de Montgomery, captain of his Scottish Guard. Montgomery was younger. Both men carried lances and wore helmets with golden visors. Lances were supposed to shatter on impact, dissipating force safely. Montgomery's lance did not shatter. It struck the king's helmet, splintered, and drove through the golden visor into Henry's eye, penetrating his brain. The king lingered for 10 days in agony before dying. Catherine became regent for her young son, Francis II, the first of her 3 sons to rule, exactly as Nostradamus had predicted. The prophecy seemed undeniable. A young lion, an old lion, golden cage, eyes pierced, cruel death. The details aligned with disturbing precision. Believers saw proof of genuine prophetic ability. Skeptics countered that tournament deaths were common, that the language was vague enough to apply to many scenarios, that we see the connection only because we know what happened. But after Henry's death, Nostradamus became untouchable. Catherine's protection was now absolute. He was famous across Europe, free to continue his work without interference from authorities who might otherwise question whether his prophecies bordered on heresy. He returned to Ceylon and to that upstairs room where the real work continued. Because the almanacs, the royal consultations, the horoscopes for wealthy clients, all of this was secondary to the project consuming him. Les prophecies. The prophecies. He had been writing them for years, filling pages with 4-line verses, each supposedly a coded glimpse of the future. The structure was unusual. Rather than organizing predictions chronologically, he arranged them in groups of 100 called centuries. Each century contained roughly 100 quatrains, though some were incomplete. The order seemed random, deliberately scrambled to prevent readers from determining when each prophecy would be fulfilled. The language was intentionally obscure, a mix of Middle French, Latin, Provençal Italian, and Greek. He used anagrams, wordplay, astronomical references. He named places and people, but often in ways that concealed as much as they revealed. Why encode prophecies so thoroughly that even he admitted most wouldn't be understood until after the events occurred? Nostradamus offered explanations. He claimed that revealing the future too openly would invite accusations of witchcraft and heresy. The Inquisition still burned those suspected of trafficking with demons. Prophecy that was too specific could be seen as diabolical inspiration rather than divine grace. He also suggested that some knowledge was too dangerous to reveal plainly. If a king knew exactly how he would die, he might alter his behavior, changing the future and invalidating the prophecy-creating paradox. Better to encode information so it could only be understood afterward, serving as confirmation rather than warning. Or perhaps, skeptics suggest, the obscurity was deliberate obfuscation. Vague predictions can be retrofitted to any event. Specific predictions can be proven wrong. If your goal is maintaining a reputation as prophet while protecting yourself from being definitively disproven, ambiguity becomes essential. The first edition of Les Prophéties appeared in 1555, the same year Nostradamus traveled to Paris. It contained the first 4 centuries, approximately 400 quatrains. The book was an immediate sensation. Copies sold rapidly, were reprinted, translated, circulated across Europe. Some verses seem to describe recent history, the Protestant Reformation, wars in Italy, conflicts between France and Spain. These were easily understood and increased confidence that Nostradamus described real events, not fantasies. Other verses describe things yet to happen: disasters, wars, the fall of cities, the rise and fall of leaders. These generated endless speculation. How did he do it? What method allowed him to perceive the future? In his preface to Les Prophecies, addressed to his infant son Caesar, Nostradamus described his method in characteristically vague terms. He spoke of astronomical calculations combined with divine inspiration. He referenced ancient practices: water in a brass bowl as a scrying medium, nighttime sessions when his mind was most receptive. He described entering trance-like states, a flame appearing, divine presence filling the room. In these moments, he claimed to see across time, witnessing events centuries ahead as clearly as if they were unfolding before his eyes. Or so he claimed. The alternative explanation is more mundane. Nostradamus was well educated, with access to historical texts, astrological treatises, political intelligence. He understood patterns of history, cycles of war and peace, shifts of power between nations. He could make educated guesses based on current tensions. His prophecies of distant future events could simply be imaginative extrapolations, contemporary trends projected forward. His obscure language ensured that whatever happened, someone could find a quatrain that seemed to predict it. But some predictions, even allowing for ambiguous language and selective interpretation, seem to describe specific events with unsettling accuracy. Century X, Quatrain 20, describes a night attack across a bridge many believe. This refers to Napoleon's crossing at Arcole in 1796, more than 2 centuries after the verse was written. Century 2, Quatrain 51 mentions London burning in the year 66, seemingly predicting the Great Fire of London in 1666, exactly a century after Nostradamus' death. Century I, Quatrain 60 describes an emperor born near Italy who will cost the empire dearly, being less prince than butcher. Napoleon was born in Corsica, technically Italian territory, became emperor, and his wars cost France enormous casualties. The most famous example concerns Hitler. Century 2, Quatrain 24 refers to Hister, which believers identify as an anagram for Hitler. The verse describes beasts ferocious with hunger crossing rivers, suggesting German invasions of World War II. Skeptics counter that Hister was actually an old Latin name for the Danube River, that finding Hitler requires creative reading. This pattern repeats throughout the centuries. Each generation finds new relevance, discovering their crises hidden in cryptic quatrains. World War I, atomic bombs, September 11th, climate change, pandemics, all have been found in Nostradamus' verses by those determined to find them. The question remains, does this represent genuine prophecy, or the human tendency to find patterns in randomness, to see meaning in ambiguity? We want to believe someone understood the chaos of history, that the future follows some comprehensible pattern. Nostradamus offers that comfort, suggesting someone saw what was coming, even if understanding arrives only after the fact. Let that thought drift away as your mind settles deeper. Chapter 3, The Final Vision. By 1566, Nostradamus' health was deteriorating rapidly. The gout that had plagued him for years worsened. Dropsy developed painful swelling in his legs that made movement agonizing. At 62, he was old by 16th century standards, clearly approaching the end. He knew it. He arranged his affairs with the methodical care of a man who understood exactly what was coming. On June 17th, he summoned notary Joseph Roach to his home. The will he dictated was detailed and precise. He left money to salons poor, provided dowries for young girls without means, divided his considerable estate among his wife and children with exact specifications. The house with its secret study went to Anne. Specific furniture pieces were designated for particular children. Books were carefully allocated among his sons. The will reveals a man concerned with fairness, with providing for family, with ensuring his reputation wouldn't be squandered in inheritance disputes. But the most striking element appeared in a codicil added 2 weeks later. Nostradamus specified exactly how he wanted to be buried. Upright in the wall of the Church of the Cordeliers in Ceylon, standing rather than lying down. The reason remains mysterious. Some saw it as final defiance, refusing to lie down even in death. Others interpreted it as ensuring he would be literally upright on Judgment Day. Still others suggested it prevented anyone from walking over his grave, a concern oddly specific unless he anticipated people trying to do exactly that. Summer heat intensified. Nostradamus weakened daily. By early July, he was confined to bed, unable to move without assistance. Breathing grew labored. Fluid in his lungs made each breath a struggle. His secretary, Jean de Chavigny, remained with him, devoted to his master, recording final words and actions with the care of a disciple, documenting a saint's passing. On July 1st, Nostradamus called Chavigny to his bedside. The conversation that followed would be endlessly analyzed. Nostradamus allegedly told his secretary that he would not find him alive at sunrise. The prophecy of his own death, delivered with the same certainty he'd brought to predictions about kings and kingdoms. Whether genuine prescience or simply a dying man's awareness of his failing body remains debatable. Doctors often know when the end is imminent. The signs are clear to those trained to read them. Chavigny asked if there was anything his master needed. Nostradamus reportedly replied that he had no further need of doctors or medicines. The irony was heavy. The man who'd made his fortune treating others now acknowledged his condition was beyond treatment. That night, Nostradamus struggled to breathe. The dropsy had reached his lungs. Each breath came harder than the last. Sometime in the early hours of July 2nd, between darkness and dawn, Michel de Nostradame died. The prophecy to Chavigny had proven accurate. The secretary did not find him alive at sunrise. The funeral was held 2 days later. Despite summer heat that made delay impossible, the ceremony was elaborate. The entire town turned out. Nobles from nearby estates attended. The body, dressed in fine clothes, was placed upright in the church wall as specified. A plaque was mounted nearby, the Latin inscription praising his learning, medical skill, and prophetic gifts. It suggested future generations would recognize what his own age had only begun to understand. Anne survived him by 16 years, dying in 1582. She never remarried, maintaining the household and protecting her husband's reputation. Chavigny became official interpreter and defender of the prophecies, publishing commentaries that would shape how future generations understood his master's work. But death did not end Nostradamus' story. In many ways, it only began the transformation from man to myth. Without their author to clarify or contextualize, the prophecies became pure text, open to any interpretation that seemed to fit. The ambiguity that had been a feature became the defining characteristic. Each new generation found its own crisis reflected in the quatrains. Each catastrophe produced interpreters convinced they'd found the relevant prophecy, predicting exactly what had just occurred. In 1791, more than 2 centuries after Nostradamus' death, French revolutionaries broke into the Church of the Cordeliers, destroying religious symbols and monuments to the old order. Someone noticed the upright body in the wall, the plaque identifying the famous prophet. The story that spread claimed they found the body perfectly preserved, that a medallion around the skeleton's neck bore the date 1791, that Nostradamus had predicted even this desecration. The story is almost certainly false, invented by royalist sympathizers. But it spread anyway, becoming part of the legend. The actual remains were moved several times as the church underwent renovations. Eventually, they were placed in the Collegiate Church of St. Laurent in Ceylon, where they rest today beneath a plaque identifying him as the town's most famous resident. The prophecies remained in print, still bestsellers during times of crisis. New interpreters continued emerging, each claiming to have finally decoded the master's true meaning. The French Revolution produced fresh Nostradamus fever. Both revolutionaries and royalists claimed his prophecies supported their cause. When Napoleon rose to power, new interpreters explained how Nostradamus had predicted this too: the emperor born near Italy, the crossing of rivers, the transformation of Europe. The 19th century brought scientific skepticism. Rationalists dismissed Nostradamus as fraud or madman. Defenders responded by finding new predictions matching industrial revolution, democracy's rise, technological innovations to specific quatrains. But the 20th century would provide the most dramatic test. The catastrophes of the modern era, 2 world wars, Holocaust, nuclear weapons, terrorism, would either vindicate the prophecies or expose them as meaningless. Believers cite verses that seem to predict Hitler, Hiroshima, modern conflicts. Skeptics demonstrate that with flexible interpretation, almost any prediction can fit almost any event. The pattern continues. The coronavirus pandemic generated dozens of publications claiming Nostradamus predicted it. Climate change, political upheavals, economic collapses, all supposedly hidden in verses waiting to be discovered. Why does this persist? Why do millions still consult Nostradamus when facing uncertainty? Part of the answer lies in prophecy's nature itself. We live in overwhelming complexity where events seem random and meaningless. Prophecy offers pattern, suggesting history follows comprehensible design. If Nostradamus knew what was coming, perhaps the chaos isn't chaos at all. There's also the appeal of exclusivity. Interpreting Nostradamus requires skill, knowledge, insight. Those claiming understanding position themselves as special, possessing wisdom ordinary people lack. And there's the undeniable thrill of mystery. The verses are genuinely cryptic. They tantalize, suggesting meaning without revealing it. Solving a Nostradamus quatrain feels like cracking a code, gaining access to forbidden knowledge. But perhaps the deepest reason is more fundamental. We are afraid. Afraid of the future, of death, of catastrophe. Nostradamus offers the possibility that someone understood what was coming. Even if prophecies predict disaster, they suggest disaster has meaning, fits some larger pattern. That's more comforting than accepting terrible things happen randomly, that history is chaos, that no one knows what comes next. Let that understanding settle gently as sleep draws near. Chapter 4. Patterns in Chaos. To truly understand Nostradamus, we must return to the plague years, because they transformed him, showed him how societies collapse, how people behave when death surrounds them, how power structures crumble and reform. These weren't mystical visions. They were observations patterns he recognized by watching the same horrors unfold town after town. When plague struck a community, perhaps a third of the population would die within weeks. Nostradamus walked into these nightmares repeatedly, while most doctors fled. He saw things that would haunt anyone, but he also saw patterns. He noticed certain behaviors spread disease, while others contained it. He observed how panic could be as destructive as illness itself. He watched leaders make identical mistakes repeatedly, saw crowds turn on scapegoats, witnessed the predictable progression from fear to violence to exhausted acceptance. These observations gave him something valuable, a map of how humans respond to crisis. Not prophecy, but psychology. Not mysticism, but pattern recognition. His plague remedies, the rose pills, emphasis on cleanliness, dietary recommendations weren't magic. They were early public health measures based on careful observation. The approach itself was revolutionary. Systematic observation leading to practical intervention. This same methodology appears in his prophecies, though disguised in mystical language. He wasn't channeling spirits. He was extrapolating from patterns. He'd seen how religious conflicts escalated, how royal succession disputes led to war, how economic pressures created social instability. The prophecies applied the thinking he used in medicine, Observe symptoms, identify patterns, predict likely progression, except instead of diagnosing individuals, he was diagnosing civilizations. Consider the Great Fire of London prophecy. The verses mention fire consuming a city, blood in streets, a displaced king. Interpreters point to this as proof he saw 1666 specifically. But fires regularly destroyed medieval cities. Political violence was constant. Monarchs were frequently overthrown. He wasn't predicting a specific event so much as describing a category of events that happened repeatedly. This is why his prophecies seem to work. They describe patterns recurring throughout history. Every generation finds its own fire, its own war, its own catastrophe that seems to match what Nostradamus wrote. His medical work reveals something else crucial. Nostradamus understood the power of presentation. His plague remedies came wrapped in elaborate instructions, complex recipes, precise rituals. Were all these details necessary? Probably not. But they made remedies seem more powerful, more authoritative. The same theatrical instinct shaped his prophecies. Midnight sessions, elaborate preparation rituals, archaic language, astronomical references all created an aura of profound mystery. He was performing the role of prophet, understanding that performance itself was part of what made people believe. This doesn't necessarily mean conscious deception. Performance and belief aren't opposites. He may have genuinely believed his visions were divinely inspired while simultaneously crafting them for maximum impact. What was his purpose? Partly fame, certainly. Partly money he made comfortable living for prophecies. But there's evidence of something deeper. His prophecies consistently warn against religious fanaticism, tyrannical rulers, horrors of war. They're not neutral predictions. They carry moral weight, urging readers toward tolerance and away from violence. In this sense, Nostradamus wasn't trying to reveal the future so much as prevent certain futures. The prophecies function as warnings. This is where your current path leads. His medical work followed the same logic. Intervene early to prevent catastrophe. The ambiguity that makes his prophecies so adaptable may have been intentional for exactly this reason. By keeping them vague, he ensured they could speak to multiple generations facing different crises. Each era could find its own warning, its own call to choose differently. But there's a paradox. If prophecies are warnings meant to change behavior, then accurate predictions represent failures. If people see catastrophe coming and do nothing to prevent it, the prophecy hasn't served its purpose. The goal isn't prediction, but prevention. This explains why Nostradamus' defenders aren't bothered by failed prophecies. The prophecy that doesn't come true might be most successful. Perhaps it warned people away from that particular disaster. The real Nostradamus emerges somewhere between charlatan and prophet, a brilliant observer of human behavior who packaged insights in mystical language because that's what his era would accept. A doctor who understood patterns and probabilities, trying to inoculate society against its own worst tendencies. His medical training shaped everything. In medicine, you learn bodies follow predictable patterns. Certain symptoms lead to certain outcomes unless you intervene. Disease progresses in recognizable stages. Nostradamus applied this medical model to history itself. Societies have symptoms: religious extremism, economic inequality, succession crisis. These symptoms progress in predictable ways unless someone intervenes. His prophecies catalog these patterns. They're less predictions than diagnosis. This interpretation explains both successes and failures. When he seems accurate, he correctly identified a recurring historical pattern. When he seems wrong, he misreads symptoms or circumstances changed unpredictably. Medicine doesn't work perfectly either. Doctors make wrong diagnoses constantly. That doesn't mean medicine is worthless. Did Nostradamus himself understand this? His letters show a man who took work seriously, who spent enormous time studying history, astronomy, medicine, current events. He wasn't just sitting in darkness, waiting for visions. He was researching, analyzing, connecting disparate information. But he also genuinely believed in astrology, divine providence, possibility of prophetic insight. His worldview allowed for both careful analysis and mystical revelation. They weren't contradictory to him. Modern minds struggle with this because we separate rational analysis from mystical experience. But Nostradamus lived in an era that saw no such division. Mathematics connected to mysticism. Medicine included prayer alongside treatment. Astronomy and astrology were the same discipline. His prophecies reflect this integrated worldview, combining political analysis with astrological calculation, historical pattern recognition with apocalyptic religious imagery. The result is something that can be read either as sophisticated commentary or mystical revelation, depending on what the reader brings to it. And what they find tells us as much about them as about Nostradamus. Let these patterns dissolve gently as rest deepens. Chapter 5. The Mirror of Time. What the prophecies actually accomplished becomes clear when we step back from debates about accuracy. They didn't prevent wars, avert disasters, or save lives through advance warning. No government changed policy based on a quatrain. No military altered strategy because Nostradamus predicted defeat. The predictions, even when believers claim accuracy, come with recognition only after the fact, when they can no longer help anyone. What they did accomplish was psychological. They transformed random tragedy into predicted events, chaos into pattern, meaningless suffering into part of a grand design. When the world felt most out of control, the prophecies whispered that someone had seen it coming, that it was somehow meant to be. This explains why Nostradamus resurfaces during historical crisis. Not because prophecies become more accurate during turbulent times, but because the need for their comfort becomes more acute. The 16th century had its own crisis driving people to prophecy. Religious wars with no resolution, plague returning cyclically with no understanding of cause, political instability as old feudal orders collapsed. In that context, a man claiming to have seen the shape of things to come offered hope that chaos was temporary, that beyond confusion lay comprehensible order. 5 centuries later, different crises produce the same hunger. Prophecies get dusted off, reinterpreted for new audiences, applied to new fears. Specific anxieties change, but underlying need remains constant. We want to believe history moves according to some plan, even if that plan is known only to a French physician who died in 1566. But this belief carries consequences. When people become convinced the future is predetermined and knowable, it shapes how they engage with the present. Why work to prevent disaster if disaster is prophesied? Why struggle to change outcomes if outcomes are fixed? Nostradamus likely understood this dynamic. His letters show someone keenly aware of human psychology, of how to position himself, of what people wanted to hear. The vagueness of quatrains wasn't accidental incompetence. It was strategic genius. Specific predictions can be proven wrong. Vague suggestions never can. He also understood the power of mystique. The elaborate rituals he claimed to perform, invocations of ancient wisdom, astrological calculations, these weren't necessary for prediction if he actually possessed prophetic ability. They were theater designed to make prophecies seem more legitimate, rooted in arcane knowledge beyond common understanding. The mythology that grew after death amplified this mystique exponentially. Stories of supernatural abilities multiplied with each retelling. The monist physician became a wizard. The careful astrologer became a seer communing with cosmic forces. None of it required actual prophetic ability. It only required that first generation of believers to start the process, and human nature to sustain it. Each person who found meaning in a quatrain became an evangelist, sharing discovery, convincing others. Belief spread not through evidence, but through social transmission, one converted reader at a time. This social dimension explains why Nostradamus persists while other prophets fade. He accumulated enough believers early enough that a self-sustaining community formed, developing its own experts, traditions of interpretation, standards of evidence. It became an ecosystem that could survive indefinitely, immune to outside criticism because it generated its own internal validation. Modern technology amplified this exponentially. Before the internet, enthusiasts were isolated, scattered across geography. Now they form global networks, sharing interpretations instantly, coordinating responses to skeptics, creating endless content. The documentary about Nostradamus predicting smartphones reaches millions not because it's true, but because it's engaging. The YouTube video analyzing quatrains gets recommended not because it's accurate, but because it generates watch time. Truth becomes irrelevant in an attention economy. What matters is engagement, and prophecy is deeply engaging, creating mystery, suggesting hidden knowledge, promising insider understanding. Nostradamus himself would likely recognize this dynamic. He was a showman, a marketer, someone who understood how to capture attention and build reputation. But perhaps the deepest irony is that prophecies have become genuinely predictive in one way he never intended. They predict human behavior, not specific events, but reliable patterns of how people respond to uncertainty. Every time crisis emerges, we can predict with near certainty that someone will claim Nostradamus foresaw it. Every time that claim is made, some portion of population will believe it. Every time belief spreads, no amount of debunking will eliminate it entirely. These patterns are more reliable than any quatrain. They tell us something real about human psychology, about our relationship with the future, about what we need to believe, even when evidence suggests we shouldn't. The scholars who study Nostradamus historically have shown definitively what the prophecies actually were: commercial publications by a clever writer working in a popular genre. But that knowledge hasn't ended the prophecy's influence, and never will. Because belief in Nostradamus isn't really about Michel de Nostradam. It's about us, about our need for pattern and meaning, about our discomfort with randomness, about our hope that someone somewhere understands what's coming. The man who died in Salon de Provence in 1566 was mortal, limited, bound by constraints of his time and knowledge. The myth that grew from his writings is immortal, unlimited, adapting endlessly to new contexts. The man could only see as far as his own historical moment. The myth sees wherever people need it to see. This is why Nostradamus will outlive every debunking, every scholarly refutation, every failed prediction. Not because he was right, but because the need he fulfills is eternal. As long as humans face uncertain futures, we'll seek prophets. As long as we seek prophets, Nostradamus will be there, his quatrains ready to be reinterpreted for whatever age discovers them. The prophecies aren't windows into the future. They're mirrors reflecting our present anxieties back at us, dressed in the costume of prediction. Each generation sees its own fears in the verses, finds its own crisis foretold, discovers its own meaning in the ambiguity. And perhaps that's not entirely worthless. If prophecies help people process uncertainty, find meaning in chaos, feel less alone in anxiety about what's coming, then they serve a purpose even while being objectively wrong about the future. The comfort may be false, but false comfort still comforts. Let that gentle comfort carry you now toward sleep. Chapter 6. The eternal question. The house on Rue de la Poissonnerie still stands in Salon de Provence. Tourists photograph it. The grave in St. Laurent still draws visitors. The prophecies still sell. And none of it matters in the way believers think it does. Because here's what we've learned about Michel de Nostradam. He was a capable physician who survived plague through a combination of skill, unconventional methods, and extraordinary luck. He was a clever writer who understood how to package predictions in language vague enough to survive indefinitely. He was a shrewd businessman who built a brand that would outlive him by centuries. And he was a man who lived through catastrophic uncertainty and found a way to profit from everyone else's need to believe someone understood what was coming. That's not prophecy. That's genius of a different kind entirely. The real prediction wasn't in the quatrains. It was in the structure itself. Nostradamus predicted that humans would never stop searching for patterns in chaos, that we'd continue projecting fears onto ambiguous texts, that hunger for certainty would override evidence indefinitely. That prediction has proven absolutely accurate for 500 years. But it didn't require supernatural insight. It only required understanding something anyone watching people during crisis could observe. We're terrified of randomness. We'll grasp at anything suggesting the future follows comprehensible rules. The prophecies exploit this vulnerability brilliantly. They offer just enough specificity to seem meaningful, while remaining vague enough to fit almost anything. They suggest insider knowledge while never quite delivering it. It's a perfect system for generating endless engagement without ever being definitively proven wrong. And perhaps that's the final lesson, not about Nostradamus, but about us. About what we're willing to believe when reality feels uncontrollable. About how easily we mistake pattern recognition for prophecy, coincidence for confirmation, ambiguity for accuracy. Every time someone claims Nostradamus predicted the latest crisis, they're not revealing hidden knowledge. They're revealing something about themselves, their fears, their need for meaning, their discomfort with acknowledging that most history unfolds through accident and contingency rather than divine plan. The man who wrote those quatrains understood this on some level. Whether he believed his own claims remains unknowable, but he definitely understood that people wanted to believe, and he gave them something to believe in. The fact that it meant nothing specific didn't matter. The fact that it could mean anything was precisely the point. 5 centuries later, we're still playing the game he invented, still finding new crises in old verses, still convinced that this time we've cracked the code. The cycle perpetuates itself automatically now, requiring no conscious fraud or deliberate deception. Just human nature doing what human nature does. The future remains exactly as unknowable as it always was. The difference is now you understand why people keep pretending otherwise. And that understanding is worth more than any prophecy ever written. The body stands in a wall. The books remain in print. The prophecies continue generating debate. And somewhere in that gap between what Nostradamus actually wrote and what people believe he wrote, between the historical figure and the mythical prophet, lies something that tells us more about ourselves than about the future. We are afraid. Afraid of the future, of death, of catastrophe. Nostradamus offers the possibility that someone understood what was coming. That's more comforting than accepting that terrible things happen randomly, that history is chaos, that no one truly knows what comes next. But perhaps we're capable of something better, of facing the unknown without needing someone to pretend they've seen through it, of accepting uncertainty as the price of genuine freedom, of making choices without the crutch of claimed foreknowledge. Michel de Nostradamus can't answer that question for us. He's been dead for 458 years. His prophecies, misunderstood, misinterpreted, and endlessly recycled, continue without him. They'll continue without us too. The only question is what we choose to do with them. Whether we let them comfort us into passivity or use them as a reminder that the future isn't written. That prophecy is impossible, and that our choices matter precisely because no one knows how things will turn out. That uncertainty is where we actually live, not in a world of prophecy and predestination, but in the space between what we know and what we fear. Nostradamus offered an escape from that space. 5 centuries of history suggest we should stop trying to escape and learn to live there honestly instead. The prophecies will survive this conclusion, just as they've survived every other. But at least now, you know what you're looking at when you see them. Not windows into tomorrow, but mirrors of today. Not prescience, but pattern recognition. Not prophecy, but poetry that got taken too seriously. And that might be the most useful thing anyone can tell you about the most famous prophet who never actually predicted anything at all. Let that thought drift away now. Let the story of Nostradamus fade gently into the background. Let your breathing slow and deepen. The future is unknowable, and that's perfectly fine. For now, there's only this moment. Only rest, only sleep. Good night.